Now, the coercing is not UK column words, as you'll see in a minute, but just so that we know what coercion is, it's the practice of forcing another party to act in a, quote, involuntary manner by use of threats or force. Now, let's take our minds back to this diagram, which UK column produced, showing that Bill Gates was absolutely central to every single piece of policy around COVID lockdown and the desire to get those vaccines in. And you've just shown, Mike, that they are still after getting Bill Gates vaccines to everybody in the country before we're free. But this is the bit we need to concentrate on, the Scientific Advisory Group for Emergencies, SAGE. And what have we got to report? Well, we were given 2 days ago an internal document from SAGE, and let's have a look at what it is talking about. It's dated the 26th of March 2020. The headline is Options for Increasing Adherence to Social Distancing Measures. Question to be addressed: what are the options for increasing that adherence? The paper addresses 2 distancing measures: general social distancing by everyone and shielding vulnerable people for at least 12 weeks. So there's part of your answer, Mike. It's clearly known inside SAGE that they're not going to let elderly people out of their homes. And this is the note at the end of the document, so that people know we're dealing in factual documents here. This paper was prepared by SAGE's Behavioural Science Subgroup, SBI-B, for discussion at SAGE 18 on the 23rd of March. Now, we've taken some damning excerpts out of this document, but it's real, and my goodness, this is so dangerous. So here's the government talking about persuasion, perceived threat. A substantial number of people do not feel sufficiently personally threatened. It could be that they're reassured with the low death rate in their demographic group, although levels of concern may be rising. And what does it go on to say there in bold? The perceived level of personal threat needs to be, quote, increased amongst those who are complacent, using hard-hitting emotional messaging. To be effective, this must also empower people by making clear the actions they can take to reduce the threat. Now, that last statement, Mike, is not about the actions they can take, it's the actions the government wants them to take, and the reason it is saying it's going to make people more fearful in order to get this agenda across.
But I'm struggling to see how this is not a direct psychological attack on everybody in this country.
It is, Mike. It is a direct psychological attack. And if you look at the number of charities and organisations saying that we've got an increasing mental health problem in this country, people are stressed, people are, some of them in suicidal position, this is the British government using applied behavioural psychology inside the COVID science group to make people frightened so that it can put its agenda in place. When we get to the end of this document, you're not going to believe what it says. But let's move on. So here we've got part of a table which appears at the end of the document. It's called APPEASE. That comes from the title of the columns: acceptability, practicability, effectiveness, affordability, spillover effects, and equity. And I'll say to David, I'll come to you on equity in just a moment. But look at what it is saying down here. Use the media to increase the sense of personal threat. Use the media to make people fearful. And why do you do that? Well, psychologists have been telling us all weekend, you do that because when people are fearful and stressed, it is easier to use applied behavioural psychology to get them to do what you want. It even admits that this could be harmful, but of course it only describes it as a spillover effect. This is a bit like talking about collateral damage instead of saying thousands of people, innocent people killed in a war. This is a very callous document. David, equity we had a little discussion on, because when we look at this excerpt from the SAGE behavioural document, there's no humanity in it, there's no compassion. There is nothing to do concerned about other people who are sick. But what does equity mean, do you think?
Well, that's a very good question, because it could mean one of two things. It could mean some sort of impartiality or fairness. That's something that you would think the government would call fairness, because they love that word. It usually comes before they pick your pocket. But the other definition, the legal one, is of course a body of law that falls outside the common law. It's just very interesting that that word should crop up in that law.
Indeed it is. So let's move on. We've got government-controlled social disapproval. Now think about this. For the government to be using social disapproval, the government has got to get into that community in order to stir up that disapproval. So it says social disapproval from one's community can play an important role in preventing antisocial behaviour or discouraging failure to enact pro-social behaviour. Consideration should also be given to the use of social disapproval, but with a strong caveat around unwanted negative consequences. So they're recognising here that if you go in and stir up one part of a community against another part, what can you have? You can have brutality. You can have people attacked in the streets because they've dared to give the wrong response to another member of the public. And it goes on. Government-controlled enablement. And so what have we got here? Community resourcing. People are being asked to give up valued activities and access to resources for an extended period. They need to be compensated. And it goes on, adequately resourced community infrastructure and mobilisation needs to be developed rapidly and with coverage across all communities. Now here what we're seeing is the government is putting its tentacles right the way into society. This will be through local authorities, parish councils, but also through charities in order to get its message across. So we get a note through our door from a local charity thinking it's their opinion. No, this has come from the government. And if we come back to the appease template here, I can't give you them all because we simply don't have time, but this is the social distancing evaluation grid. And I'm looking at the options on the left-hand side. And what do we see? We see this. Use the media to increase the sense of personal threat. Use the media to increase the sense of responsibility of others. Use the media to promote positive messaging around actions. Tailor the messaging and use and promote social approval for desired behaviours. This is like something out of communist China. This is Boris Johnson's government using the wider media to use his applied behavioural psychology to keep us locked up. I can't express how dangerous it is, Mike. When we got this document, it was unbelievable. We know there are more, and we're hopeful we're going to get some more of those documents. Now, this is the methodology, and what does the SPY B team have to say? They have to say this. This report was drafted by 2 members of the SPY B panel, and 9 further members commented, following which the report was revised. Well, okay, but here's a caveat that also sits close to that comment. Caveat. Much of the evidence that's been drawn on is very recent and has, quote, not been subject to peer review. In some cases, the source is a SPY B paper that involves expert opinion. This report has been put together rapidly and has been subject to limited scrutiny and review. So we have a team cobbled together, no checks on their work, and what is the result? That the population of UK is to be kept in their houses and the whole of UK industry is to be shut down, producing the worst economic decline in 300 years. Mike, if this wasn't real, you would say, I can't believe this, but this is their own document.
Well, it is their own document, and we can see the effect of it, because, of course, that document is dated the 22nd of March. We're now coming up to the second week of May, and we've seen the effect of this. We've seen the stories that appeared in the press. We've seen the inflammatory headlines, the clickbaity headlines, the headlines designed to instill fear. David, to my mind, this goes beyond just being dangerous. This is a criminal act.
It's utterly totalitarian because now everything you think has been manipulated by the government. It's ruled by fear, not by reason. Right? It's by fear. And the idea we're setting neighbours against one another in order to control people is deeply sinister. It makes more sense of the BBC report I saw last week, which said to snitch or not to snitch, and was a discussion on the pros and cons of reporting your neighbour for breaking COVID-19 guidelines.
Exactly. And just to ram this home to our audience today, because this is just so important, I bring you back to the government's own document, Mindspace. This is from about 2010. It was produced by the Cabinet Office and the Institute for Government. And what was it? It was influencing behaviour through public policy. This was the dangerous section of this document. That means that citizens may not, quote, fully realise that their behaviour is being changed, or at least how it is being changed. Clearly, this opens up the government to charges of manipulation, and that is exactly the charge that UK Column is going to put to Boris Johnson's Conservative government today. The government is maliciously manipulating public fear and behaviour in order to get through its political agenda. This was the warning we started to put out in 2013, the Express talking about the so-called nudge unit. This is the behavioural insights team that was producing this stuff. We warned about this pernicious charity that was working at very high level of the UK government in order to reframe people and look at what they're talking about, using idiots, running over people, undermining them, go round them, discredit them. This is vicious, vicious stuff. This is clearly applied psychology. It was being done with a charity. But let's get back to SAGE. Who are we interested in that organisation? Well, it's this gentleman, Sir David Halpin, because he is the kingpin from the Behavioural Insights team linked to the Cabinet Office. And we can go back to work that the UK Column did in 2011, where we were warning that around the Conservative government, David Cameron, of course, at the time, but also Francis Maude, the two key people, the head of the civil service, Gus O'Donnell, and an advisor, Jeff Mulgan, but also the head of that charity, Julia Middleton. And what were they working on? Sorry, I'll just put that in because Gus O'Donnell was later replaced by Sir Bob Kerslake. What were they working on? Well, they were working in the background with the French government in secret meetings with this gentleman, Oliver Willier, in order to discuss how to use this applied psychology on the minds of the British and French population. And if we take you on down, here is the man that we're interested in. This is Sir David Halpin. Dr. David Halpin, who was the kingpin of this behavioural agenda. And it was first used internally on departments inside government. DEFRA was the key one, a 34 million behavioural change programme, very, very dangerous. But on the right, of course, the objective was to get the British public to obey. And where were they headed for? A complete change of society, which was called Big Society. And of course, Eric Pickles was the big man in charge of communities at that stage. So this was our warning back in 2011 about this French expert in brainwashing, and he's been working at the heart of the British government, except the British public not told. What's the result of this policy? Death. And here was the Mirror's article saying that between 7,500 and 17,500 elderly people have died as a result of this vicious, vicious applied behavioural psychology. Now, is Hancock the fool guy because he's the one taking the heat, and the people behind the scenes repurposing the government are the key ones? Let's ask the question. The Boris Johnson Conservative government is lying over the COVID-19 statistics. We know why, to create an agenda of fear. Why is that happening? Well, practice of applied behavioural psychology on the population and to bring in a repurposed society, economy, government and constitution. This is malfeasance in public office. That is a criminal offence. The killing of elderly people, many people would say, is purely murder. David, I'm going to stop because this is so outrageous it's almost difficult to report.
It is, and it's been coming for a long time. It's fascinating that the column was covering this all those years ago, and we're now seeing the actual laying out of the process, or the fruition of the process of changing the way people think. Now, going a little bit further back in time, this in fact started back in the 20s with Edward Bernays, who invented propaganda and public relations, and I thought it'd be good to finish this section on a quote from him. He said in his piece Propaganda from 1928, "The conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organised habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society. Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government, which is the true ruling power of our country." So there we have it. An invisible government is controlling us all right now.
Absolutely. Now, David, obviously the old message was stay at home, protect the NHS, save lives. The new message, the new propaganda is stay alert, control the virus, save lives. You noticed something, or at least when we were discussing this earlier, you were highlighting one particular aspect of these two little graphics here.
Yes, the colour change. What does red mean? Red means stop. But the new slogan is surrounded by little green arrows and ticks. And what does green mean? Well, green means go.